The next step in our journey toward declaring independence has to do with a major accomplishment that occurs. And it occurs during the meeting of the Second Continental Congress. So this section is entitled the Second Continental Congress. Remember, the Second Continental Congress met because the First Continental Congress had stated if the problems that we're pointing out to Great Britain are not resolved, we'll meet again next year. Well, they were not resolved, and so they did meet the next year. And as they are gathering together, we have the first victory for the Patriots in this conflict between the colonies and Great Britain, and that is at a place called Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga is in the colony of New York, or today New York State. It begins with a group of men called Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. Now, it starts, though, with another individual, a man by the name of Benedict Arnold. He thought that it would be a good idea to attack Fort Ticonderoga. It was a poorly defended outpost in upstate New York, and yet they had a lot of supplies there that would be useful to the Patriots. Well, he received authorization from the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, which gave him cash, some men, and an assignment to gather more troops. Arnold proceeded toward his objective. So from Massachusetts, he's going to cross over into New York and attack Fort Ticonderoga. Well, while he was on his way, he received word that another force was also moving toward the same goal. So he didn't want to allow them to get there first without him, and so he prematurely hurried to join this other army, not wishing to miss out on the opportunity that he envisioned for himself. Well, Ethan Allen was that other group of people. Had led that other group of people. He and 400 Green Mountain Boys from the area that would eventually become Vermont. It was not Vermont yet, and they were operating under the authority of the Connecticut militia. So here we have one group from Connecticut going to attack Fort Ticonderoga in New York, another group coming from Massachusetts on their way to attack Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Well, when Arnold and his few dozen men caught up with Allen, Arnold insisted that they share command of the force. And Arnold was so much a pain about this that Allen finally gave in. Well, the problem with both of them was that they had been authorized by separate sources in Massachusetts and Connecticut to attack a British fort before hostilities had been formally declared by either side. Technically, there was no war yet. And it's in New York, outside the jurisdiction of either Massachusetts or Connecticut. And in fact, New York had levied a price of 100 pounds on Ethan Allen's head, considering he and his men as little more than backwoods banditti. So there were wanted posters out on Ethan Allen in New York. Well, they continued to proceed together, regardless of all those legal difficulties. Well, when it came past 4 a.m., the assault party reached the main gate. Now, there were only 40 British soldiers stationed at the fort, and most of them were either infirm, they were sick, maybe had been wounded, basically were invalids. They had been warned a month earlier by General Gage that they should tighten things up. But they only had one sentry posted outside the walls, and as the Patriots approached, he was asleep. Now, in addition, if you looked at a fort, you know that usually there's big doors that open up and the wagons can come through. You've all seen probably TV shows, movies that show the forts open up the doors, and people come in, right? You've all seen that. Well, usually beside those big doors is a smaller door, because if it's just one person coming, you don't want to open up the huge doors. Well, the sentry is there beside this one door, and as the Patriots approach, they find that not only is the sentry asleep, but the door is unlocked. Well, as they get close, the sentry does wake up, and he is startled, of course, by the sudden presence of these soldiers, and he attempted to get off a shot. But in the early morning rain, his damp musket misfired. So he threw down his weapon and ran to the barracks to raise the alarm. He was chased and caught, and then a second soldier appeared and fired at Allen, but missed. Then he rushed at Allen with his bayonet. Now, because you can only get one shot at a time, right? You got to reload. So you fire a shot, then you charge with bayonet. That's what they're taught to do, and that's what he did. Well, Allen swung his sword at the guy and struck the man a glancing blow on his head. But fortunately for the soldier, his head had a comb in his powdered wig to keep his hair in place. Or, well, I know it is powdered hair, because that was the fashion, to powder your hair to look white. And they would put these big combs. You know what a comb is? Girls, I don't know, you've seen them. You don't wear them anymore, but these big things that stick in your hair. Well, the sword hit that, and so it didn't, slice open his head like it might have. So a lot of interesting things happen as they are attempting to take this fort. Allen then demanded to be taken to the fort's commandant, Captain de la Place. Well, they were unable to wake him up, apparently, so he settled for the second in command. And so Lieutenant Jocelyn Feltham emerged, who is pictured here. And he was carrying his breeches, his pants, because he had been in bed, and didn't know what was going on. And he goes out the door and he sees 80 or so musket-bearing men standing in front of him inside of his fort. And he says, "By what authority have you entered His Majesty's fort?" Wanting to speak with the one in charge, instead of this second person, Allen shouted, "Come out of there, you damned old British rat!" Well, the apocryphal telling of this story, which appeared years later, says that Ethan Allen stated, "Deliver this fort instantly." And he was asked, "On whose authority?" And he is said to have replied, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." There are two problems with that statement. It makes a nice story, but in the first place, the Continental Congress hadn't yet met. They were going to be coming together, but they hadn't met, so they hadn't given him any authority. He probably didn't even know that the Second Continental Congress was meeting. Secondly, Ethan Allen didn't believe in God. So to think that he would say in the name of Jehovah is probably pure fantasy. So if you ever hear anybody talk about that or you see that written, it probably did not happen quite that way. Well, Arnold did, as Allen's men, because he is kind of in charge of a group of bandits. So they started looting in the fort, and Arnold insisted that the soldiers not plunder and destroy any private property. He wanted to do things properly. Allen then relieved him of his joint command at gunpoint. So the boys, the Green Mountain Boys, proceeded to turn their attention from getting hold of the cannon to looting the barracks. Well, they turned their attention eventually to getting a hold of the weaponry there, and so they were able to capture 120 cannon, 30,000 flints. Now, do you remember what flints are? Why are flints important? Yeah, because the musket has to have a spark to explode the gunpowder to shoot out the musket ball. And in order to do that, you have to have a piece of flint you stick in there, so when the steel hammer hits it, it creates a spark. So you have to have these flints available to give to men when their flints wear out. So they've got that. They've got mortars, which are like small cannon, powder, you need lots of powder, and tons of lead. So they captured a lot of stuff here at Fort Ticonderoga. Now, as the Continental Congress comes to meet, remember the first time the Continental Congress met, they were trying to get Parliament to change their mind about what they were doing. But the original purpose now has changed. Now, instead of making resolutions to the British, they are now attempting to govern. They're attempting to set up ways in which the colonies can be governed from the colonies, and the colonies as a whole, instead of from Britain. John Adams said this: "Such a vast multitude of objects, civil, political, commercial, and military, press and crowd upon us so fast that we know not what to do first." When you consider that there has never been a government over all the colonies, and for these representatives of the different colonies to come together and to try to begin to govern in some way, it is overwhelming. Where do you start? You have no constitution, you have no guidelines, you're just trying to take the place of what the British were attempting to do. Well, appearing at this Second Continental Congress, you've read about this already, was a man by the name of George Washington. Now, he appeared there because he showed up, by the way, in his uniform that he wore as an officer in the French and Indian War, his British uniform. And he came there with the intention of asking the Continental Congress to appoint him the commander of the Virginia militia. But his arrival was certainly ordained by God, because they were looking for somebody to lead the army of all the colonies, what they were calling the Continental Army. And so his presence there persuaded them to appoint him as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Now, this was significant because he was a Virginian, and a Virginian appointed to command troops which were primarily at this time up in Massachusetts, because the militia, remember, that had harassed the British all the way from Lexington down to Boston still remained in place around Boston. That was the only quote-unquote army there was at this point. And so they're sending a Virginian up there to take charge of that army. Well, there was another man from Boston who desired to be in that position. His name was John Hancock. He was a wealthy merchant in Boston. He felt that he deserved to be the one placed in charge of the army there, and was really taken aback when John Adams, also from Massachusetts, nominated Washington. Adams said of Hancock, "I never remarked a more sudden and striking change of countenance. Mortification and resentment were expressed as forcibly as his face could exhibit them." And Hancock never forgave Adams for nominating someone else to be the commander. Sam Adams seconded the motion. They both realized that this would be an important step in trying to bring the colonies together. But it left a bitter rift between these fellow patriots that never healed. As we've discussed before, the greatest strength of Washington was his commanding presence. He's standing there. He was over 6 feet tall at a time when most men were 5'4", 5'6", maybe. So he was very much taller than most of the men. And standing there in his uniform, he exhibited quite a presence there. But one of the other big reasons was the fact that he was from the South. He was a Virginian. To place someone from Boston in charge of the Continental Army in Massachusetts would be to communicate that the war was all about Massachusetts. The other colonies don't need to be concerned. But putting Washington there communicated that we need to be working together. And they're starting from a place of really not knowing what they're doing in a lot of ways. Although Washington had experience in the British Army, he is really starting afresh with this group of troops that are not trained. And so he said the sword was to be forged on the anvil of necessity. You know what an anvil is, right? And you make a sword, a blacksmith, someone like that would make a sword on the anvil, pound it into place. He's saying, well, the sword that they're using, the military abilities they have, are going to be forged, are going to come into existence out of what becomes necessary. They had no real plan. They're reacting, they're doing whatever they do in relationship to whatever the British are doing, whatever comes up. And so Washington heads north to Boston, where at the time there was a siege of Boston. The troops, the militia was surrounding Boston. The British are here in Boston City, and their ships are in the harbor. Before Washington would arrive, there would be another battle, what's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. Does any of you know what's ironic about the Battle of Bunker Hill? What? It's not a bunker. I think I'm not sure, I never thought about that, where the name bunker comes from, whether it's a person or whether it was referring to a military thing.
It didn't take place on Bunker Hill.
It didn't take place on Bunker Hill. Yeah. So if you look at this map, you can see that Bunker Hill is back here. But the battle's going to take place from this direction, and they're really going up Reed's Hill. So the Battle of Bunker Hill, I mean, you could this could be a nice trivia question for you to ask somebody someday. Where did the Battle of Bunker Hill take place? Well, you'll think, oh, that's an easy question. Bunker Hill. No, it didn't. It took place on Reed's Hill. Okay, well, enough of that simple trivia. General Gage had been joined in Boston by 3 more British generals. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. I thought I had those listed for you. Okay, I guess I don't. Johnny Burgoyne, Sir Henry Clinton, and Sir William Howe. You would have had those in the book there, in your notes from that. And he also got reinforcements. So the British are sending more generals, more reinforcements. The 3 generals also brought along fishing rods, as if they're planning for a country outing instead of a long campaign. They thought, I'm going to go over to America. I hear there's good fishing over there. So they weren't looking to really fight any battles. They thought they would have a nice, relaxing time in America. They were shocked to discover that Gage's troops were pinned down by what they considered rabble. What? Gage, you're pinned down here? They're surrounding you? How can that be? You're British soldiers. This bunch of rabble doesn't know what they're doing. They can't even fire a weapon properly. So they were kind of surprised by all that. June 16, 1775, the Patriots worked quietly all night to erect a battery on Reed's Hill. So in other words, they're digging trenches, they're digging in, they're building earth walls, earthworks there as a place of defense. Now they did it all night long, and they did it quietly so that the British in Boston could not hear what they were doing. We'll find out what happened tomorrow.
Well, I see the high ground.